Chuck Pfarrer is an American writer, film producer, and former Navy SEAL. He'll be a familiar and trusted presence to many who've tuned into the Mriya Report on X over the course of the war. As an author, Chuck has penned screenplays, novels, and comic books, as well as non-fiction works. His works feature themes relating to the military, and of course is a strong advocate for Ukrainian victory. Chuck, it's absolutely delightful to have you on the channel. I've looked forward to this for some time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an extraordinary pivot point in the war, and let's start right at a difficult topic, and that seems to be that for some in Washington, Berlin, and through Europe, the will to win seems to be softening. Do you detect that, and what do you think is behind it?
Right. Well, those thoughts are abroad, and I think that the source of that pseudo-defeatism and the land for peace advocates in the Ukraine war, they forget who started the war. Ukraine did not provoke this. They did not ask for this. Ukraine did nothing against Russia. The fact that it will be right, just, or expedient to trade terrain to Russia is ridiculous. Putin is a bully. You don't make a bully your friend by giving him your lunch money every day. There's another point that I would say. This inflection point has entered the information space in the West. It comes from Russia. And I'm going to go out on a limb here slightly. The war is not going well for Russia. They've had a summer offensive, yes, absolutely. But in 8 days in Kursk, Ukraine captured more terrain than Russia has captured all summer. So, and that terrain is not equal, right? What Ukraine has been able to do is turn the tables on Russia there. So, again, land for peace is not a solution.
And Kursk is fascinating, isn't it? Because it seems that many analysts just don't understand the reasons behind the Kursk incursion. And one of the first things that I said on the channel is that this will prompt Russia into a new wave of mobilization, which will further accelerate the economic collapse, and it will accelerate misgivings amongst the elite and indeed in Russia itself as to the wisdom of continuing the war. It'll get people not revolting on the streets, but it'll get them questioning the benefits of the whole thing. This is actually happening, and it's accelerating. It's extraordinary that this is the time. Many Western allies and analysts choose to say that, Kursk was a pointless sideshow, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly the opposite in my estimation. There was no better way to demonstrate to Vladimir Putin, his generals, and thereby, by extension, to the Russian people, that this war in Ukraine is not going well. Nothing puts that out there better than Ukraine coming across the border and capturing 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. Clearly, Minister Shoigu, things aren't going very well. The other thing that I think was Ukraine has to be very careful about putting together any large-scale maneuver operations because their supply lines are not secure in two ways. They're not secure because their allies, and principally the United States, are fickle. They don't come through on their promises. They don't deliver their arms or supplies when they're supposed to. It's impossible for Ukraine to depend on that. The other way that Ukraine's supply lines are not secure is they don't have adequate air defenses. So that means we see their cities being bombarded by Russian missiles, but there is also a great liability to Ukraine's ground lines of communication and supply. What they were able to do with the Kursk offensive is hit Russia where it was not expecting anything. And the mere feat of doing that, gathering a force, consolidating it, rehearsing it, moving it in secret to the Russian frontier, and blasting across and biting a chunk out of Kursk an amazing military feat.
And following various diaspora Russian media, they seem to be far more optimistic that Russia is losing than many in the Western media, which is interesting. And of course, they get to see a lot of the, I would say, the videos being recorded by Russian soldiers at the front. It seems that anywhere between 30 and 60,000 troops have been thrown at Kursk to try and dislodge the Ukrainians. It is not going well, it seems.
No, it isn't working. In fact, I was just preparing a map this morning on the Kursk offensive. Ukraine has opened two more vectors of attack. They have two more lodgements. They are engaging Russian troops that are cut off south of the river seam. Every time Russia tries to stage an attack from the west against the principal Ukrainian lodgement, they find mechanized Ukrainian forces operating in their rear. Every time I see that, I wonder how many more hours, days, maybe Russia could keep up those attempts from the west. You can't attack an enemy with the enemy in your rear. And again, there is no accident in Ukrainian moves here. They planned this precisely. They struck the bridges on the river seam. They've isolated these forces. They waited patiently for them to engage, and then they hit them from the rear. It's not going well for Russia.
And of course, many analysts will say, okay, well, you're doing that, but you're losing ground in Pokrovsk. Do you think the Ukrainian calculation would be that, well, they're going to lose territory in the Donbass anyway? Much better that there's a sense that they can define, the battlefield objectives in Kursk. They can change the tone to start talking about victories and capability of victories, rather than simply the narrative being about long, slow, attritional defeat in Donbass.
I think that's exactly the reason. Once Ukraine had identified the resources necessary to stage an offensive operation, so let's just say all the chess pieces necessary to make Kursk work, they had a choice. Do we fight Russia where they are strong in the east, in Donbass? Do we fight Russia where its ground lines of communication and supply are secure, where they're strong, or do we hit them where they're not expecting it? And then the decision was made. This is all before the Kursk offensive started. What is better? Would it be better for us to take back 20 kilometers in Donbass, or would it be better for us to plunge 40 or 50 kilometers rather, into Kursk and take that bit of territory, and dare I say it, take a piece of Russia hostage? And they made the right decision. We wouldn't be talking about this if Ukraine had taken 10 or 15 kilometers back in Donbass. Nobody would talk about that. But we are talking about Kursk, and the Russians are worrying about it. Well, they should.
Would Ukraine make even more progress potentially if they had permission to use things like ATACMS in long-range strike capacity?
Absolutely. ATACMS has been turned into this buzzword and this boogeyman by the Russians. Because, bear in mind, ATACMS are an artillery system, and they are designed for use in areas of operation. They're not strategic weapons. They are short-range ballistic missiles, and they are designed to break up enemy troop concentrations, logistical facilities, and command and control nodes contiguous to a battlefield. And everyone who wrings their hands over ATACMS, they lose the point that Ukraine already has indigenously designed systems that can hit Russian targets 600 miles away, 1,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers. The ATACMS is a point of contact weapon, right? Granted, with a unitary warhead, we're talking about a weapon system that could take out the Kerch Bridge, precisely the job it was designed to do. So again, this is the sort of all Russia needs to inflect the information space is inject naysaying and counter positions. They don't need to change in a binary manner, yes or no. They just need to fog it up. They just need to create a little informational chaos. And ATACMS is a good point of interest to look at that and see what is the verbiage going on around that. Do they need ATACMS? Absolutely, they do.
And of course, Storm Shadow / Scalp along with.
Same thing, absolutely. And again, another boogeyman for the Russians. Believe me, they don't want state-of-the-art, low observable air-launched cruise missiles kicking their butt in the rear. And that these are exactly the weapons that Ukraine needs. And I would say this, if the US military were operating in Ukraine under the conditions we're forcing the Ukrainians to operate, the United States military wouldn't be doing half as well. And I mean that. Without air defense superiority, air superiority, artillery dominance, and the ability to strike deep targets, the US or anyone else in NATO wouldn't be winning the fight.
And it's an extraordinary testament. Now, that, of course, doesn't really get covered too much. Another topic that really gets, I think, brushed off, but which is covered in a lot of detail in the Russian diaspora media, that is the economic situation. And it seems that Russia's erstwhile allies, Iran, but especially China, has in recent months been withdrawing the kind of financial support and instruments that were sustaining Russia's import-export model. Combined with, now I know Biden gets a lot of criticism from the pro-Ukraine bubble, but it seems that the tightening of secondary sanctions that started around 6 months ago is having a huge impact in throttling off resources and money to Putin's war machine.
Well, and we're still, embargoes or not, we're still looking at a system where Putin is making close to $1 billion a day selling Russian energy. And much of that trade is going on with at the very least, the connivance of some of our allies. For example, a great portion of that shadow fleet energy training is happening right now in the territorial waters of Greece, a NATO ally. India, which is turning its face towards the West, they are also a large consumer of discounted Russian oil. The West, and especially the United States, we're not getting serious enough about this. And to anyone who doesn't like war, does not want to see conflict, does not want to see bloodshed, it's much easier and less costly to turn off the oil tap than it is to stop the bleeding. So, folks, put your money where your mouth is, right? Let's unplug the war machine.
And that goes for dual-use technologies, doesn't it, as well, and components. And of course, the EU has not been great at preventing the export of vast amounts of goods, which, yeah, they're not directly shipping it to Russia anymore, but it's going through Central Asia. Very little attempt to halt this. Whereas individual countries like Finland, who appreciate what impact this is having, they've ceased it. They're not engaging in this kind of trade, whereas Germany, Italy are doing so on a massive scale.
Well, and there will always be someone who will make a buck. And I will go back and say there were even economic and individual entities in the United States as late as 1941 who were trading with Germany. Arguably the greatest threat to humanity that ever lived. And there were people in the United States selling them car engines, trucks, data processing, everything you can imagine. But again, if you have someone like that or an entity like that, where money is so important to them, that's how you tune your sanctions. You make sure that that is no longer an economically viable course of action. And I absolutely commend Finland, who, believe me, understands Russia and Russian intentions better than almost anyone else on earth.
I mean, the other challenge to really understand what's going on and what's going on in the corridors of power, it seems, at least to me, that the idea of preventing a Russian collapse, or the illusion that we're able to prevent a Russian collapse, seems to be higher on the agenda of people like Jake Sullivan and others than a Ukrainian victory, because what a victory is never quite united on the Allied side, even though, as we now know, Zelenskyy does have a plan for that on his side.
Well, you know, to Mr. Sullivan, with all due respect, but only slightly due respect, uh, Russia has already collapsed once, right? Well, actually, three times in history. Imperial Russia collapsed, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Vladimir Putin has embarked his nation on a path towards collapse. I am always happy to remind everybody that at the beginning of this war, I didn't think Russia would do it because it was going to be so categorically stupid. And when I saw 20-mile long convoys, Russian convoys, posed at the Ukrainian border, I said, this has got to be a bluff. Nobody parks a 20-mile long convoy on a 21st century battlefield. So I underestimated the cray-cray and the stupidity of Vladimir Putin. What happened within the first couple of weeks? Sweden broke its neutrality. Finland came over to NATO. They turned the Baltic into a NATO lake. He had no idea of the fundamental and easy to see consequences. But those consequences now are looming in his face, and they are economic and they are sociological. He's on record now urging Russian women to have 8 children so they can be thrown into the ovens of Baal, so they can be fed into this war. It's obscene, but more importantly, it's utterly desperate. This is a quagmire. This is it, you know, and it is no longer it's no longer relevant whether Ukraine can win this. What is relevant, in my assessment, and many other military observers here, it's Russia that can't win this war. They don't have the army, they don't have the equipment, and here's the rub: they don't have the leadership.
And we know that no reform is likely, no change is likely in Russia unless it experiences a military defeat. That is also something history certainly shows us. It seems, however, that there, on this front as well, allies, there's a certain amount of I would say, naivety towards the Russian opposition, naivety towards their ability to gain power and root out the kind of sort of KGB knotweed that has taken over every aspect of society. And for people who don't understand how toxic that is, imagine if the SS had survived World War II and went on to run their own country. That's essentially my view of what you've got there. Do we need to, I would say, get realistic about what is possible in Russia and move more towards a containment strategy rather than optimistically thinking that somehow it'll, magically fix itself and not be a threat in the next 5, 10, 15, or even 50 years?
No, I agree with you completely. What has to be done in Ukraine, and the West has to realize this and come to this conclusion, whether through sheer cynicism or actual humanity. None of Russia's neighbors are going to be safe until Putin no longer has the instrument and implement of terror, right? They're not going to be safe until there is no credible Russian army. And look what we're looking at. 400,000 Russian casualties. UK Defense Intelligence, and I doubted this report when I first heard it, but this was months ago. I agree with it now categorically. 95% of Russia's military capability is concentrated in Ukraine. They were a superpower. Have they swept the Ukrainians into the Dnipro? Have they pushed them all towards Poland? No. And here's the other thing. Does Russia have Operation Overlord? Do they have a big plan to win this war with multi-level divisions operating in concert in a major ground offensive? No. And they don't have the means to do it. And they don't have the leadership to do it. And they don't even have a plan. So when you take those factors into consideration, this is the United States in Vietnam in 1970. They haven't lost, but no one thinks they can win. And we know what happened in Vietnam.
And of course, there's no plan to even retake their own sovereign territory. All they can do is pretend that it doesn't matter, which is an extraordinary.
What does he call it? The situation that has developed, right? 1,000 square kilometers of your territory uh, on your watch, taken out of your country, right? So I would say this too: the dirt that has been taken in Kursk is much more important than the dirt that is being lost ahead of Pokrovsk, which, by the way, still stands, right? Those Russian forces operating in Donbass, they may have culminated, meaning they have exhausted their resources. They have ground down their personnel. They have not pushed that very much farther, and maybe they won't. We're coming to the end. Fall is upon us now, so we'll see.
And that's an interesting point. I mean, there's two questions really. One's a short one. Are the Ukrainians maybe better fitted and better suited to continue operations as the winter sets in? And then the last question really is, what do allies need to do if they're going to align with victory rather than the nebulous, as long as it takes kind of slogan?
Well, I'll answer the winter question first. Absolutely, Ukraine will be more suited to survive and campaign this winter. There are fundamental questions, and we know this because Russian soldiers make videos of it constantly, saying things like, we're not getting fed, we're not getting water, we don't have adequate equipment. Come this winter, not getting fed, the US Army calculates a soldier needs 5,000 calories a day to operate in the wintertime. If you don't have adequate clothing, you can be hors de combat in 3 hours in extreme weather. It can be done for you. So it's going to be very difficult for Russia this winter. And taking ground is not the same as holding on to it forever. Okay, regarding what can we do instead of we're in this forever, those are just words. Show Ukrainian leadership that when you promise something, you're going to deliver it. Prove to them that you're a reliable ally. The biggest villain in this drama is the United States of America. That is the villain. We are inconsistent. We waffle. We go back and forth. And we have resisted every important weapon system that has made it to Ukraine. F-16s, the United States has categorically not. Then it said, we're not going to let our allies even give them. Then finally, overwhelmed by NATO, they had to go along with it. But let's test the United States commitment on F-16s. Right now, here's how many pilots are training in the F-16 pilots in the United States. That's the number. 2 of them. Is that a commitment? I'm not sure it is. So let's shame the United States into doing the right thing.
I mean, given that the US provided the Soviet Union with not just 2 or 10, but many thousands of aircraft, plus all of the kerosene they required in World War II, to Stalin.
Absolutely. Lost on the world, you watch Russian newsreels, and it's the T-34. The number 1 tank used by the Russians was the Sherman, right? So, look, it is imperative for the security of Europe and our NATO allies that Russia not be allowed to embark on this expansionist journey. I promise everyone, should Ukraine fall, what's in it for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, nations that don't have the resources that Ukraine has? It's so simple to me. And I don't know when the national security apparatus of the United States thought or began to think that Russia could be taken on its word on anything. Lavrov told Liz Truss less than 24 hours before the invasion that there was no plan to invade. He said that to her face. So did he stop lying, or will he not lie anymore? What, again, they just, and I'm not an unreconstructed Cold Warrior. I simply read Russian history. I simply read it.
And that's the core strategy. Lying and subterfuge, both internally and externally, is the absolute foundation of their strategy.
Well, the other thing is, you know, I see Russian military failures in Ukraine. I see them. I am out on a limb, but my assessment is still, this war is unwinnable for Russia. But I will say this, in terms of information warfare, Russia is the reigning world champion and perennial superpower. And the United States hasn't seen the ball since kickoff. Russia.
That's what we're tackling. Yeah, that's what we're aiming to tackle together.
Exactly.
Well, Chuck, it's a huge pleasure. This is hopefully the first of many such conversations. I'm delighted to have you on the channel, introduce you to the audience, although many will be already familiar with your fantastic work. This has been great, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was a pleasure, and I'll see you soon.